The colony on Verath IX was the kind of place that made people believe in the future again. A green and golden world, where tall grass swayed under twin suns, and rivers ran clean and cold through valleys that stretched on forever. It was, by every measure, a paradise at the edge of known space. 12,000 humans called it home, and they had built something beautiful here. Farms that grew food enough for twice their number. Homes carved from the pale stone of the hillsides. And at the center of their largest settlement, a sprawling building of glass and white metal called the Helios Learning Center, where nearly 2,000 children laughed and learned and played every single day. Commander Lyra Vasquez stood on the balcony of the administration building and watched the morning light spill across the valley below her. She was 63 years old, retired from the Terran Union Navy after 30 years of service. And she had chosen this quiet world as the place where she would finally rest and breathe and live for something other than duty. But old soldiers never truly rest. And so when the colony needed a civilian administrator, she had stepped forward because that was simply who she was. The kind of person who could not sit still while work needed doing. She watched the children streaming into the Helios Learning Center far below, tiny figures in bright clothes moving like a river of color through the morning air. And somewhere among them were her two grandchildren, Milo and Suri, 9 years old, twins with their mother's dark eyes and their grandfather's stubborn jaw. They were her entire world now, these two small people. And every decision she made as administrator came back to one simple question. Was this colony safe enough for them to grow up in? She could tell. Was yes. Verath IX was shared between humans and the Varani, an insectoid species with hard carapaces the color of dark bronze, and multifaceted eyes that glittered like black gemstones. The Varani had been here first, technically, though they had never settled this particular continent. And the Galactic Concord had brokered the arrangement. Humans on the western landmass, Varani on the eastern archipelago, and a shared zone in between where the two species could trade and learn from one another. It worked, mostly. The Varani were not warm creatures in the way humans understood warmth. But they were intelligent and pragmatic, and many of them seemed genuinely curious about humanity. About human music, human food, the strange way humans touched each other so casually, the way human children ran and screamed and tumbled over one another like small wild animals. Ambassador Torek Zale was the Varani diplomatic representative on Verath IX, and Vasquez had come to respect him over the 2 years they had worked together. He was tall for a Varani, with a crest of iridescent chitin that he kept polished to a mirror shine, and he spoke Terran Standard with a clicking accent that Vasquez found oddly pleasant. He came to see her that morning, and she noticed immediately that something was wrong. His movements were tight and controlled, the way a Varani moved when they were trying very hard not to show fear. "Commander Vasquez," he said, and his voice was quieter than usual, "I must speak with you about a matter of some urgency, and I must ask that what I say does not leave this room." Vasquez gestured to the chair across from her desk, and Zyle folded his long limbs into it with the careful precision of someone who had learned to navigate furniture built for a different species. "There are voices within the Dominion Council that grow louder each cycle," he said. "Voices that say humanity expands too quickly, claims too many worlds, breeds too fast, and they look at colonies like this one, and they see not cooperation, but invasion by another name." Vasquez leaned back in her chair and studied him. She had heard rumors of this, whispers that traveled through diplomatic channels like smoke through a cracked wall. But hearing it spoken aloud by a Varani official was something else entirely. "How loud are these voices?" she asked. "Loud enough that I felt compelled to warn you in person rather than through official channels," Zale replied, and the way his mandibles tightened told her everything his words did not. She thanked him and promised to increase the garrison's readiness, and after he left, she sat alone for a long time, staring out at the valley and the children and the golden light, and she thought about all the times in human history when someone had said, "It will be fine," right before everything fell apart. Captain Daro Makembe commanded the Terran defense garrison on Verith IX, a modest force of 300 soldiers equipped for peacekeeping rather than war. He was a good man, earnest and competent, the kind of officer who ran drills on schedule and kept his soldiers sharp, even when there was nothing to be sharp for. When Vasquez called him in and told him about Zale's warning, he listened carefully and nodded and said he would move to a heightened readiness posture. More patrols, tighter sensor coverage, faster response protocols. "Do you think it's serious?" he asked. "I think," Vasquez said slowly, "that I have been in enough wars to know that the most dangerous moment is always the one you convinced yourself would never come." Makembe doubled the watch that night, and for a week nothing happened, and then another week, and the soldiers began to grumble the way soldiers always do when asked to stay alert against a threat that never appears. It is the oldest trap in warfare, the slow erosion of vigilance by the simple passage of uneventful time. On the far side of the system, hidden behind the dense radiation shadow of Verath's largest moon, something waited in the dark. A fleet of 47 Varani warships, their hulls coated in sensor-absorbing compounds that made them nearly invisible against the black of space. Hive Commander Skethus stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked at the tactical display, showing the human colony glowing like a warm ember on the planet's surface. He was old for a Varani warrior, his carapace scarred from a dozen campaigns against lesser species, and he had spent the last 3 years arguing before the Dominion Council that humanity was a plague that needed to be checked before it consumed everything. The Council had not officially approved his plan. That was the beauty of it. What he was about to do carried the quiet blessing of powerful voices who would deny all knowledge if it failed, and claim credit if it succeeded. His plan was elegant in its cruelty. He would not attack the human soldiers, not directly, not at first. Instead, he would take the one thing that humans valued above all else, the one thing that would make them kneel and beg and agree to anything. He would take their children. The soft species protects its larvae with irrational ferocity, he had told his officers. And this is their weakness, because a species ruled by emotion can be controlled through emotion. Seize the young, and the adults will do whatever we demand. His second-in-command had asked what would happen if the humans did not comply, and Skethus had made a sound that was the Varani equivalent of laughter. "They will comply," he said. "They are soft, they are emotional, they will weep and beg and give us everything we want, because that is what soft species do when you hold their children in your claws." It was the worst miscalculation any species had ever made about humanity. As the twin suns set over Verith IX, children of the Helios Learning Center slept safely in their beds for the very last peaceful night they would know for a long time. The Varani's stealth fleet began its descent through the atmosphere, silent and dark as falling knives. Skethus gave the order with absolute confidence, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who had never once in his long life been truly afraid. "Seize the offspring," he commanded. "The soft ones will submit when their larvae are in our claws." He could not have been more wrong, and by the time he understood just how wrong he was, it would be far, far too late, not just for him, not just for his fleet, but for every world the Varani Dominion had ever claimed among the stars. The morning came soft and golden, like every morning on Verath IX. But this one would be remembered for centuries as the day the galaxy learned what humanity truly was when something precious was taken from them. It started at dawn, just as the first children were arriving at the Helios Learning Center, their voices bright and careless in the early light. The Varani dropships came down fast and hard, out of a sky that had been clear one moment and full of dark shapes the next. And before anyone could understand what was happening, armored Varani soldiers were pouring through every entrance of the school. They moved with the terrifying efficiency of insects, fast, coordinated, silent except for the clicking of their clawed feet on the polished floors. Within 8 minutes, they had sealed every exit with bioelectric barriers that hummed with a sound like angry wasps. And within 12 minutes, they had herded nearly 1,800 children into the Central Assembly Hall. Some of the teachers tried to fight. A man named Thomas Reeves threw himself at a Varani soldier twice his size and was struck down with a blow that shattered his collarbone. And a woman named Priya Anand managed to hide 11 children in a supply closet before a Varani officer found them and dragged them out. 3 teachers were killed in those first terrible minutes, shot with pulse weapons that left their bodies broken on the hallway floors. The children screamed and cried and called for their parents, and the sound of it carried across the settlement like a wound torn open in the morning air. Captain Mkembe heard the alarms and mobilized his garrison within 4 minutes. But when his soldiers moved toward the school, they found Varani heavy weapons emplacements blocking every approach. And when he tried to contact the orbital defense satellites, he discovered they had already been destroyed. The Varani fleet in orbit had knocked out every military asset in space before the first soldier had even touched the ground. His communications officer reported that all long-range transmitters were being jammed by a broadband signal so powerful it turned every frequency into static. They were cut off from Earth, from the Terran Union, from everyone. Mkembe was a good soldier, but he had never faced anything like this. And for one terrible moment, he stood frozen while his mind tried to process the fact that nearly 2,000 children were being held at gunpoint less than a kilometer from where he stood. And there was nothing, absolutely nothing he could do about it, with 300 soldiers and no orbital support. Hive Commander Skethis broadcast his demands from the bridge of his flagship, and his voice echoed through every speaker in the colony with the cold, clicking precision of a species that did not understand mercy. "Humans of Vareth 9, he said, "we hold your young in our care, and their continued well-being depends entirely on your cooperation. The Varani Dominion requires the immediate and permanent cession of this world and 6 neighboring systems, the dismantlement of all Terran military outposts within 50 light-years, and a formal declaration of Varani territorial supremacy. You have 1 planetary rotation to accept these terms, and should you refuse or attempt any rescue, the children will be processed." The word processed was a Varani military term that had no direct translation into any human language, but its meaning was understood by everyone who heard it, and it was the kind of word that turned blood to ice. Inside the school, the children were terrified, packed together in the assembly hall under the watchful eyes of Varani soldiers, who stood along the walls like statues made of dark metal. The youngest ones, 4 and 5 years old, sobbed without stopping, their small bodies shaking, and the older children tried to comfort them with the desperate courage of people who are just as afraid, but know that someone has to be brave. Pa! A 14-year-old girl named Jaya Osei became the leader none of them expected. She was tall for her age, with dark skin and close-cropped hair, and eyes that burned with a fury she kept carefully hidden behind a calm she did not feel. She had been walking to her classroom when the dropships came, and she had seen the soldiers kill one of the teachers, a kind old man who taught music, and something inside her had gone very still and very hard in that moment. She gathered the older children around her and spoke in whispers, organizing them into groups, each one responsible for a cluster of younger kids. She found water bottles in the cafeteria storage room and distributed them. She located the maintenance corridors beneath the building, narrow tunnels meant for pipes and wiring, and began hiding the smallest children inside them, telling them it was a game, telling them to be very quiet and very brave. Milo and Suri Vasquez were among the hostages, and Suri had been crying since the soldiers came. But Milo held his sister's hand and would not let go. And when Jaya found them, she looked into Milo's eyes and saw something she recognized. The same stubborn refusal to break that she saw in their grandmother. "Keep her safe," Jaya whispered to him, and Milo nodded once without saying a word. Across the settlement, Commander Lyra Vasquez received the news in the administration building, and the officer who delivered it would later say that watching her face in that moment was the most frightening thing he had ever seen. Not because she screamed or raged or wept, but because she did none of those things. She went completely still. Eyes, which had been warm and tired just moments before, became something else entirely. Something ancient and cold and absolutely without mercy. She sat down at her desk, opened a drawer, and removed a device that looked like a simple black card, no bigger than her palm. She pressed her thumb to its surface, and it glowed red, and she typed in a code that she had memorized 30 years ago, and never once believed she would actually use. It was called a black cipher, and it was the most terrible communication in the entire Terran Union military lexicon. A code that existed for one scenario and one scenario only. A scenario so unthinkable that most officers treated it as theoretical, a relic from a darker age that would never actually be needed. The black cipher meant a hostile alien species has deliberately targeted human children. She transmitted it on a frequency that cut through every jammer ever built, because it did not travel through normal space. It traveled through quantum-entangled relay stations buried in the fabric of space-time itself. Stations that could not be blocked or intercepted or even detected by any known technology. The signal crossed 400 light-years in less than a second. Standing nearby, watched her transmit the code and asked Captain Mkembe what it meant. And Mkembe, who had gone pale as death, answered in a voice barely above a whisper, "It means God help them, because nothing else will." Vasquez looked up at Mkembe, and her voice was steady and low, and carried the weight of every war humanity had ever fought. "Hold this colony together," she said. "Keep our people calm, keep our soldiers ready, and do not, under any circumstances, give that creature what he wants. Help is coming, and when it arrives, the Varani are going to learn a lesson that the galaxy will never forget." Mkembe wanted to ask how she could be so sure, but the look in her eyes answered his question before he could form the words. This was not hope he was seeing, it was certainty, the absolute unshakable certainty of a woman who knew exactly what her species was capable of when someone made the mistake of hurting their children. Far away, impossibly far away, and yet connected by bonds that transcended distance, the signal arrived. Deep beneath the surface of Earth's moon, in a bunker that had been built during the darkest days of the Unification Wars, and maintained every single day since, in the hope that it would never be needed. A console lit up red, for the first time in the entire history of the human species. Admiral Helena Cross was the officer on duty that night, a woman with silver hair and steady hands, and 40 years of service to a species she loved with every fiber of her being. She read the code once, then read it again, and then she closed her eyes and sat very still for exactly 5 seconds. When she opened them, there were tears on her cheeks, but her voice did not shake, not even a little. "Activate the Hearthguard protocol," she said. "Mobilize everything we have, and I mean everything. Every ship, every soldier, every weapon. Send the word to every fleet command in every system. Tell them what has happened, and tell them this." She paused and looked at her officers, and every person in that room felt the weight of what she was about to say, settle onto their shoulders like a mantle of iron. "Someone has taken our children," she said, "and we are going to get them back. And then we are going to make certain that no one in this galaxy ever dares to do this again. Not to us, not to anyone, not ever." The machinery of human wrath began to move, and it was vast beyond comprehension. And it was coming, and nothing in the universe was going to stop it. The galaxy watched, and the galaxy held its breath. News of what had happened on Verath IX broke through the Varani jamming within hours, carried by independent traders and diplomatic couriers, and 100 other channels that no blockade could fully contain, and it spread through the civilized systems like fire through dry grass, on news feeds and diplomatic cables, and whispered conversations in the corridors of power on 100 different worlds. The reaction of the galactic community was a mixture of shock and fascination, and something that many species would later admit was a kind of dark curiosity. Hostage situations were not unheard of in interstellar politics. The Gorathi had done it. The Solween had done it. Half a dozen other species had at one point or another used civilian populations as leverage in territorial disputes, and in every single case, the outcome had been the same: negotiations, concessions, a diplomatic settlement that gave the aggressors most of what they wanted because the cost of fighting was simply too high. Many alien observers expected the same from humanity. The humans would bluster and threaten and ultimately accept some version of Skethis' demands, because that was what rational species did when their people were in danger. They calculated the odds, weighed the costs, and chose the path of least destruction. They did not understand humans at all. 42 hours after the Black Cipher was transmitted, the sky above Verath IX tore open. 400 warships of the Terran First Expeditionary Armada dropped out of hyperspace in a formation so precise and so vast that the Varani sensor operators stared at their screens in disbelief. 7 of those ships were Titan-class dreadnoughts, vessels so massive that they cast shadows on the planet below, each one carrying enough firepower to reduce a continent to glass. Every ship flew a black banner on its transponder signal, an ancient human tradition that dated back to the age of wooden ships and salt water. It meant no quarter, no negotiation, no mercy. It meant whatever happened next was beyond the reach of diplomacy. Admiral Kessler Rowe stood on the bridge of the dreadnought Prometheus and looked at the tactical display with the calm, steady gaze of a man who had spent his entire career preparing for a moment he had prayed would never arrive. He was 58 years old, thin and precise, with gray eyes that missed nothing, and a reputation for being the most methodical strategist in the Terran Navy. The kind of officer who planned for every contingency and never raised his voice because he never needed to. He opened a communication channel to the Varani flagship, and when Skethis' image appeared on the screen, Rose studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Hive Commander Skethis," Rose said, and his voice was so calm it was almost gentle. "I am Admiral Kessler Rowe of the Terran Union Navy, and I am going to explain your situation to you exactly once, so I suggest you listen carefully." Skethis clicked his mandibles in what passed for contempt among his kind. "You would not dare attack while we hold your larvae," he said. "You are emotional creatures, and your emotions make you predictable. You will do as we demand because you cannot bear the thought of your young being harmed." Rowe did not blink. "You misunderstand what you have done," he said. "You believe you have gained leverage, that by holding our children you have created a situation where we must negotiate. You are wrong, and I need you to understand how completely wrong you are before you make a decision that cannot be undone." He leaned forward slightly, and though his voice never rose above a conversational tone, every being in every ship monitoring the transmission felt the temperature drop. "You have not gained leverage," Rose said. "You have simply guaranteed that there is no outcome, none, in which your species survives this encounter intact. Release every child, unharmed, within one planetary rotation, and your worlds will stand, your people will live, and your civilization will continue. Harm one hair on one child, and I will reduce every world you have ever touched to molten rock, and I will salt the void where they orbited, so that nothing grows there for 1,000 years. This is not a negotiation. This is not a threat. This is a statement of fact, and your rotation begins now. The channel closed, and for the first time in his long career of conquest, Hive Commander Skethis felt something he had never felt before. A cold tremor deep in his thorax that his species had no word for, because his species had never needed one. Across the galaxy, the galactic concord erupted into chaos. Diplomats from 30 species scrambled to intervene, sending urgent messages to both sides pleading for restraint, warning of the consequences of open warfare, offering to mediate, and humanity's ambassador to the Concord, a woman named Elena Voss, stood before the full assembly and delivered words that would be carved into the walls of diplomatic academies for centuries to come. For decades, she said, you have called us aggressive. You have called us paranoid and warlike. You have mocked us for our armies and our warships and our weapons. And you have asked us why. Why does a species that claims to want peace build the largest military in the known galaxy? She paused and looked around the chamber at the hundreds of alien faces watching her, and her voice did not waver. Now you know why, she said. We built them for this. We built them for the one moment when something precious is taken from us, and the only acceptable response is absolute overwhelming force. We did not build our fleets for conquest or glory or territory. We built them because somewhere in our bones, in the deepest part of what makes us human, we knew that someday someone would be foolish enough to touch our children, and on that day we would need the power to end worlds. She straightened her back, and her eyes were hard as iron. Send your diplomats if you wish, she said. Send your mediators and your peace envoys and your strongly worded resolutions. But know this. If a single child is harmed, your diplomats will be negotiating with a species that no longer exists. The chamber was silent, and in that silence, dozens of alien civilizations understood for the first time that they had been living alongside something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Not because humans were cruel or bloodthirsty, but because humans had a line that could not be crossed, and the penalty for crossing it was absolute. While the diplomats talked and the fleets stared each other down across the void, something else was happening, something quiet and invisible and far more deadly than any warship. The Ghost Walkers had arrived. They were Terran special operations at its most elite. Soldiers who had been selected and trained and enhanced for one purpose: to go where no one could see them and do what no one else could do. 12 of them had infiltrated the colony through an ancient network of mining tunnels that predated the settlement. Tunnels that did not appear on any Varani map, because the Varani had never thought to look for them. They moved through the darkness beneath the school like shadows given purpose, and when they reached the maintenance corridors, they found what Jaya Osei had left for them without knowing it. Hidden children, tucked into crawl spaces and pipe junctions, frightened but alive. A ghost walker named Sergeant Cade Morrow made contact with Jaya through a ventilation grate, and when he whispered to her that help was here, she did not cry with relief the way he expected. Instead, she looked at him with those burning eyes and whispered back, "There are more on the upper floors, and the guards change every 40 minutes, and the barrier generators are in the east wing. I have been watching them." Morrow stared at this 14-year-old girl who had been gathering intelligence under the noses of an alien occupation force, and felt something tighten in his chest that was equal parts admiration and fury. Admiration for her courage, and fury that any child should ever need to be this brave. The Ghost Walkers mapped the interior of the school, counted every guard, identified every barrier generator, and transmitted everything back to the fleet in coded bursts, so short they were indistinguishable from background radiation. And then the moment came that changed everything. Skethis, feeling the pressure of the human armada looming above him, decided to demonstrate that his threats were not empty. He ordered a group of the youngest hostages, children between 4 and 6 years old, moved to an exposed courtyard where the human fleet could see them, a living shield and a warning. Among them was little Suri Vasquez, her face streaked with tears, clutching the hand of a boy she did not know, because her brother Milo had been separated from her when the guards moved the group. A Varani soldier shoved the children forward roughly, and when Suri stumbled and fell and began to cry, the soldier struck her across the back with the flat of his weapon. Not hard enough to break bones, but hard enough to knock a small girl to the ground, hard enough to make her scream. A Ghostwalker drone no bigger than a fingernail recorded every second of it, and the operative watching the feed transmitted 2 words back to the Prometheus in a voice that shook with barely contained rage. They struck. Admiral Rowe received the report on his bridge, and the officers around him would later describe what happened to his face in that moment. The way his jaw tightened, the way his gray eyes went flat and empty like the surface of a frozen lake. The way he stood very still for exactly 3 seconds, while something enormous and terrible crystallized inside him. When he spoke, his voice was the quietest anyone had ever heard it. So be it, he said, and every person on that bridge understood that the time for warnings was over, and that what came next would be something the galaxy would remember for as long as stars burned in the dark. Admiral Rowe removed his cap and set it on the console in front of him, and every officer on the bridge recognized the gesture for what it was, an old naval tradition, centuries old, that meant the time for formality was over, and what remained was only the work. Execute Hearthfire, he said. All units, no restrictions. The words traveled at the speed of light through the fleet, and 400 warships that had been holding position in perfect stillness erupted into coordinated motion like a single living organism waking from sleep. The Prometheus shuddered as its main batteries powered up, a deep vibration that traveled through the hull and into the bones of every person aboard. And across the formation, ship after ship after ship lit up their weapon systems, until the dark of space around Vareth 9 glowed with the cold blue light of human fury made manifest. What followed took place across multiple worlds and multiple time scales, but it all began in the same moment, and it was all part of the same terrible and necessary reckoning. Inside the Helios Learning Center, the Ghostwalkers moved. Sergeant Cade Morrow gave the signal at exactly the moment the fleet opened fire on the orbital Varani positions, because the thunder of battle above would mask the sounds of battle below. And in the same heartbeat, 12 operatives breached every critical point of the building simultaneously. They came through walls and floors and ceiling panels like ghosts made solid, and they brought with them a violence so precise and so absolute that the Varani soldiers inside the school barely had time to understand they were dying before they were dead. The Ghostwalkers did not use standard weapons. They used close-quarters tools designed for exactly this scenario, silent and lethal, and precise enough to kill a soldier standing 3 feet from a child, without so much as disturbing the child's hair. The operation took 11 minutes from first breach to final clearance, and in those 11 minutes, every single Varani soldier inside the Helios Learning Center was killed, not wounded, not captured, not given the chance to surrender, because the protocol was explicit and had been written in a time of absolute clarity about what the consequences should be for anyone who held human children at gunpoint. Jaya Osei was waiting in the maintenance corridor when Morrow found her, and she had already organized the younger children into groups of 10, each led by an older student, ready to move. When he told her it was time to go, she nodded once, and then turned to the children behind her, and said in a voice that was steady and strong and far older than her 14 years, "We are going home now. Stay close and stay quiet, and hold each other's hands, and I promise you that no one is going to hurt you again." She carried a 5-year-old boy on her back the entire way through the tunnels, a child named Arun, who had not spoken since the soldiers came, and who clung to Jaya's neck with a grip that left bruises she would wear for weeks afterward. She did not complain, did not slow down, did not stop, until every single child in her care was out of the tunnels and in the arms of the human soldiers waiting on the other side. Milo and Suri Vasquez were among the last to be evacuated. Milo had found his sister again in the chaos of the breach, and had wrapped himself around her like a shield. And when the ghost walker who found them tried to separate them to carry them out faster, Milo looked up with his grandmother's eyes and said, "I am not letting go of her." And the soldier, a man who had killed 6 Varani in the last 10 minutes without blinking, felt his throat tighten and simply picked them both up together. Above the planet, the Battle of Arath Ain unfolded with a speed and savagery that stunned every species monitoring the engagement. The Varani fleet numbered 47 warships, and they were good ships crewed by experienced soldiers, but they had been built to fight the kinds of wars the Varani understood, wars of position and patience and gradual advantage. They had not been built to fight a species that attacked the way humans attacked, which was everywhere at once, with everything they had, and with a fury that turned tactical doctrine into something closer to a force of nature. The Titan-class dreadnoughts fired first, and their main batteries, weapons so powerful they were normally restricted by Galactic Concord Treaty, struck the Varani fleet like the fist of an angry god. 3 Varani cruisers simply ceased to exist in the first volley, converted from warships into expanding clouds of superheated debris in less than a second. The remaining Varani ships tried to form a defensive formation, but the human fleet was already among them, smaller frigates and destroyers weaving through the gaps with a speed and aggression that defied every model the Varani had built of human naval tactics. The humans fought as if they did not care whether they lived or died, and the truth was that in that moment, many of them did not. They cared only that the ships above those children were destroyed, and they threw themselves at the enemy with an abandon that bordered on madness. In 47 minutes, it was over. Every Varani warship in orbit was either destroyed or disabled, and the wreckage formed a ring of twisted metal around the planet, like a crown of ruin. Human ships tractored in the Varani escape pods and took the surviving crews prisoner. Because even in their fury, the humans drew a line between soldiers who followed orders and soldiers who hurt children, and the crews who had remained in orbit had done the former, but not the latter. Simultaneously, and this was the part that truly terrified the galaxy, pre-positioned Terran fleets struck across 6 star systems in a coordinated assault that had been planned in the 42 hours since the Black Cipher was sent. Every Varani military shipyard, every orbital weapons platform, every fleet staging area, every military communications relay was targeted and destroyed with surgical precision. The Varani Dominion's military infrastructure, built over centuries of conquest and expansion, was systematically and comprehensively dismantled in less than 72 hours. It was not a war. It was an erasure, carried out with the cold efficiency of a species that had decided exactly how much force was necessary and then applied precisely that amount and not 1 joule more. And throughout all of it, throughout the killing and the destruction and the systematic dismantlement of an empire, the narration must record something that the galaxy found almost more disturbing than the violence itself. The humans were not enjoying it. There was no celebration on the bridges of the Terran warships, no cheering when Varani vessels broke apart, no satisfaction in the eyes of the admirals watching their fleets tear through the enemy's defenses. Soldiers wept as they fought, actual tears rolling down actual faces inside actual helmets, because they understood that what they were doing was necessary and terrible, and that the necessity did not make it less terrible. When the ground fighting on Vareth IX spread beyond the school to the Varani military positions across the colony, human medics treated wounded Varani soldiers alongside wounded humans, applying the same care and the same urgency to both, because the oath they had taken did not distinguish between species, and neither did they. A human marine squad found a group of Varani civilians, workers, and families who had nothing to do with Skethis or his invasion, huddled in a damaged building near the shared zone. And instead of passing them by or treating them as enemies, the Marines secured the building, distributed water and rations, and called in an engineering team to shore up the collapsing roof. Ambassador Torek Zale was found in the wreckage of Diplomatic Quarter, his carapace cracked and leaking fluid, his body curled around a cluster of Varani children he had been shielding from falling debris. Human Marines pulled him and every one of those children to safety and carried him to a field hospital, where a human surgeon spent 4 hours putting his shattered body back together. When Commander Vasquez visited him 2 days later, he looked up at her with his multifaceted eyes and said, "I tried to warn you, and I am sorry that my warning was not enough." Vasquez looked at this alien who had risked his life to protect children, his own species' children, and she reached out and placed her hand on his undamaged arm, a gesture that in Varani culture meant nothing, but that she knew he had learned to understand from years of living among humans. "You tried," she said, "and I will never forget that." Hive Commander Skethis was captured alive in the command center of his ground forces, surrounded by the bodies of his personal guard. The ghost walkers who took him did not harm him, did not strike him, did not even raise their voices. They simply restrained him and informed him that he was being taken into custody to stand trial for crimes against sapient young. Skethis stared at them with what his species expressed as total incomprehension. In Varani military tradition, a defeated commander was executed by the victors. It was clean, it was expected, it was the way of things. The concept of a trial, of being judged by laws rather than by strength, was so alien to him that it frightened him more deeply than death ever could. "You are not going to kill me?" he asked, and there was genuine confusion in his clicking voice. The Ghostwalker sergeant who led the capture team looked at him with eyes that held no hatred and no mercy, and said, "No, killing you would be easy, and what you did does not deserve easy. You are going to sit in a room and listen while the galaxy tells you exactly what you are. And then you are going to live with that knowledge for the rest of your very long life." Skethis had faced death many times and never flinched, but in that moment, looking into the cold, steady eyes of a human who had every reason to kill him and chose not to, he felt the first true fear of his existence. Not fear of pain or death, but fear of something far worse. The fear of being understood. 3 months passed, and the galaxy was still trying to understand what it had witnessed. The Vareth IX incident, as it came to be known in the diplomatic records of 40 different species, had lasted less than 4 days from first shot to final surrender, but its consequences would reshape interstellar politics for generations. It was not the violence that haunted the galactic community. Violence was common enough among spacefaring civilizations. It was the nature of the violence, the speed and totality and terrible precision of it, and most of all, the reason behind it. Every species in the Concord had fought wars over territory and resources and pride, and a dozen other motivations that made rational sense in the cold calculus of interstellar competition. But no species had ever witnessed what happened when you gave humanity a reason that transcended calculation, a reason that reached down into the deepest and oldest part of what made them human, and pulled out something that could not be measured or predicted or contained. The trial of Hive Commander Skethus was held on the Concorde Station at Meridian Point, a vast orbital platform that served as neutral ground for interstellar legal proceedings. It was the most watched event in galactic history, with observers from every known civilization filling the gallery and billions more watching through relay feeds across hundreds of worlds. The prosecution was led not by a military officer, but by a civilian lawyer named David Achebe, a quiet man with reading glasses and a gentle voice, who had spent 30 years prosecuting war crimes in Terran courts. This choice was deliberate, and it was noticed. Humanity had sent not a warrior but a scholar, not a sword but a scale, and the message was unmistakable. Achebe presented his case with methodical patience, building it fact by fact and testimony by testimony. He showed the Concorde the footage from the Ghost Walker drones, the children herded like animals, the teachers killed, the little girl struck to the ground by an armored soldier twice her height. He called witnesses who spoke in trembling voices about what they had seen and what they had felt, and he did it all without raising his voice or appealing to emotion, because the facts themselves were emotional enough. Skethus was given a full defense, a team of legal advocates drawn from 3 different species who challenged evidence, cross-examined witnesses, and argued procedural points with genuine vigor. This too was deliberate, because humanity wanted the galaxy to see that even the being who had committed this act was entitled to justice, that the same species capable of destroying a military empire in 72 hours was also capable of sitting quietly in a courtroom and letting the law do its work. The verdict was unanimous: guilty of crimes against sapient young, guilty of unlawful use of force against a civilian population, guilty of violating 14 articles of the Galactic Concorde Charter. The sentence was life imprisonment without possibility of release, to be served in a facility on a neutral world, where he would be treated humanely and given every comfort except the one thing he had tried to take from 1,800 children, his freedom. Skethus received the sentence in silence, and those who watched him said that something had broken inside him during the trial. Not from cruelty, but from comprehension. For the first time in his life, he had been forced to sit and listen, while the consequences of his actions were laid out in precise and unflinching detail, and the weight of it had done what no weapon ever could. The Varani Dominion itself was not destroyed, and this was perhaps the most remarkable part of the entire affair. Humanity's fleets had dismantled the Dominion's military with absolute thoroughness, but they had not touched the Varani homeworld. They had not bombed civilian centers or poisoned water supplies or committed any of the 1,000 atrocities that victorious species had inflicted on the defeated throughout galactic history. The Varani people, farmers and teachers and builders and artists and children, were left unharmed, because humanity had drawn a distinction that many species found almost incomprehensible. The Varani military and the leadership that had sanctioned Skethus's operation were held accountable. The Varani people were not, because the people were not responsible for the actions of their leaders, and humanity refused to punish the innocent for the sins of the powerful. The Dominion's territory was reduced to its core systems under Concorde supervision, and its government was restructured with oversight to ensure that no faction like Skethus's could ever seize military power again. It was a punishment, yes, but it was also a mercy, and the combination of the two left the galactic community deeply unsettled, because it did not fit any model they had for how victorious species behaved. Ambassador Torek Zio, who had tried to prevent the crisis and had nearly died protecting children during its aftermath, was chosen by his people to lead the reformed Varani government. It was a remarkable choice, a diplomat rather than a warrior, a bridge builder rather than a conqueror. And many saw in it the first evidence that the Varani were capable of learning from what had happened. Zale opened his first official address to the Galactic Concord by doing something no Varani leader had ever done in the recorded history of his species. He apologized. He read aloud the name of every human child who had been taken hostage, all 1,800 of them, one by one, and for each name he expressed the formal Varani words of deepest shame, a ritual so old and so sacred that most Varani had never heard it spoken aloud. It took over 3 hours, and he did not stop or rest until the last name was spoken. And when he finished, the chamber was silent in a way that transcended language or species. In the weeks that followed, the Galactic Concord ratified a new amendment to its charter, passed unanimously by every member species for the first time in the organization's history. It came to be known informally as the Human Law, though its official title was the Declaration on the Inviolability of Sapient Young. It stated in language that left no room for interpretation that the deliberate targeting, harming, detaining, or threatening of the children of any sapient species as an act of war, coercion, or political leverage was an absolute and inviolable prohibition, and that any species found in violation would face the collective military response of the entire Concord. Humanity had not simply protected its own children, it had ensured that no species' children would ever be used as pawns again. And this was the part that the galaxy struggled with most, because it meant that the most violent response in interstellar history had led to the most compassionate law ever written. And the contradiction was so perfectly human that no other species could have conceived of it. Jaya Osei was awarded the Terran Union's highest civilian honor, the Star of Earth, in a ceremony attended by billions. She walked to the podium in a simple dress, her close-cropped hair freshly cut, and she looked out at the vast audience and spoke in a voice that was clear and young, and carried the unshakable honesty of someone who had not yet learned to hide behind fine words. "People keep calling me brave," she said, "but I was not brave. I was terrified every single second of every single minute, and I cried when no one was looking, and I wanted my mother so badly I thought my chest was going to break open. But I was the oldest one in the room, and when you are the oldest one in the room, you take care of the little ones, because that is what being oldest means. You do not get to fall apart, because someone smaller than you needs you to hold it together." She paused and looked down for a moment, and when she looked up again, her eyes were bright with tears she did not try to hide. "So I held it together," she said, "and I would do it again, and I will do it again, every time, for the rest of my life, because that is what we do. We take care of the little ones." Half the audience wept, and across the galaxy on worlds that had never seen a human in person, beings of every shape and form watched this young girl speak and understood something fundamental about the species they shared the stars with. Commander Lyra Vasquez retired fully from public life after the ceremony. She handed the administration of Verithai X to a younger officer and moved to a small house on the edge of the rebuilt settlement, a house with a wide porch that looked out over the valley where the grass still grew tall and golden under the twin suns. She was seen most often in the late afternoons, sitting on that porch with a cup of tea, watching Milo and Suri play in the field below. They had nightmares still, both of them, and there were nights when Suri woke up screaming, and Vasquez held her until the shaking stopped. And there were days when Milo went quiet, in a way that no 9-year-old should ever be quiet. They were healing, slowly, the way all wounded things heal, not by forgetting, but by growing strong enough to carry what they remembered. One afternoon, Vasquez watched as a Varani child, a small one, no older than Suri, approached the twins cautiously at the edge of the field. And there was a moment of stillness, a held breath. And then Suri reached out her hand, and the Varani child took it. And they began to play together in the golden light, while the grass swayed around them like a benediction. Vasquez smiled, and it was the first real smile anyone had seen on her face in months. And she closed her eyes and let the warmth of the twin suns fall on her face, and felt, for the first time since that terrible morning, something that might have been peace. Decades later, in a lecture hall on a world far from Earth, an elderly professor of interstellar relations stood before a class of students drawn from a dozen different species, and delivered the lecture that would become the most quoted passage in the history of xenopolitical studies. A student, young, curious, with the bright, eager eyes of someone who had never known war, raised a manipulatory appendage and asked the question that every new generation eventually asks. Professor, why do the other species fear humans? They are not the strongest species, nor the most technologically advanced, nor the most numerous. So why is it that every civilization in the Concord treats them with such careful respect? The professor was silent for a long moment, and the students saw something move behind those ancient eyes, a memory perhaps, or a grief, or a lesson learned in fire and paid for in blood. Because most species fight for territory, the professor said, and resources, and pride, and power, and all of the things that rational civilizations fight for when diplomacy fails and war becomes the only language left. Humans fight for these things too. They are not so different from us in that regard. The professor paused and looked out the window at the stars. But there is one thing for which humans do not fight, the professor said. One thing for which they do not negotiate, do not calculate, do not weigh costs against benefits or measure acceptable losses. There is one thing for which they simply annihilate, completely, utterly, without hesitation and without mercy, and without any force in the universe capable of stopping them. The professor turned back to the class, and every student felt the weight of centuries settle into the silence. They're children, the professor said. The universe has many laws, young ones. Gravity, thermodynamics, entropy, the speed of light, the expansion of the void. These are the laws of physics, and they cannot be broken. But there is one more law, unwritten in any equation, that is enforced not by the mechanics of the cosmos, but by the wrath of a species that will burn the galaxy to ash before it lets its young come to harm. The professor leaned forward and spoke the words that every student in that hall would carry with them for the rest of their lives. You do not touch the children of Earth, not now, not ever, not for any reason. Because the humans built their entire civilization, every ship and every weapon and every alliance, around one single promise, that anyone who harms their young will be erased from the stars so completely that the void itself will forget they ever existed. The lecture hall was silent, and through the great windows the stars burned cold and bright and eternal. And somewhere among them, on a golden world with twin suns, children played in a sunlit field, human and alien together, hand in hand, safe beneath a sky that would never darken. Again, because humanity had made sure of it.